Tonight on Nation to Nation, the political panel is not impressed with Doug Ford. The Ontario Premier is firing his child advocate.
This is, to me, a really devastating decision by Mr. Ford, and I think it's a really stupid decision.
The federal government is backing away from the Indigenous rights framework. It was promised by the Prime Minister before the next election.
This is a case of, overpromise and underdelivers.
And a former TRC commissioner says a national holiday honoring Indigenous people is a teaching moment.
It is Canada that has still so much yet to learn. It is everyone else.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. Tonight we continue to look at issues within child welfare. It's a crisis that never seems to get better. As we said last week, the Ontario government is closing the office of its child advocate. It's been operating for 10 years, advocating for the rights of children. And just this week, a group of Indigenous youth from Northern Ontario met with the Prime Minister. They asked Justin Trudeau for a child advocate for the North. But does a child advocate save lives? So on the show is Mark Miller, Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Cathy McLeod, Conservative Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and NDP MP Charlie Angus. Welcome to Nation to Nation. Mr. Angus, I'll start with you today. You tweeted that more kids are going to die in care now that the Doug Ford government is closing the Child Advocate's office. Why do you think that is?
Unless you've really been up close in the crisis in child welfare, it's incomprehensible to believe the negligence that children are facing. We've had 19 children die in 3 months in foster care. We're seeing some of the highest suicide rates in the world in Ontario. Irwin Elman was on the front line time and time again, dealing with cases like young Amy Owen, who died of 13, among the many who died in that year of suicide in the foster care system. This is, to me, a really devastating decision by Mr. Ford, and I think it's a really stupid decision by Mr. Ford because he's setting off a very toxic relationship with the Indigenous people of the North in the region of Treaty 9, where you're going to see most of the mineral exploration and development happening. If you're saying you don't give a damn about kids, the Indigenous communities, at this point in our nation's history, they're standing up, they're going to defend the rights of children, and I think Doug Ford has made a serious mistake on this.
Of course, the Child Advocate's been around for a good decade or so, but it hasn't stopped. You mentioned the suicide crisis. It didn't stop that. So how effective was he?
Well, this is the problem, is that you have one voice having to deal with both federal negligence and provincial negligence. And often the advocate isn't able to come in until after a horror story, like a young child who's basically starved and beaten to death. But then he can start to say, from here on in, we're going to start to have new rules in place. But I can tell you, on many of the horrific crises we've seen in the child welfare system and in the suicide crisis, Irwin Elman was on the ground. He was, I spoke to him time and time again. And I think the fact that it happens on a week when the Nan youth are here, the Anishinaabe youth, who are really powerful young speakers, and they're saying, the youth rights, children's rights has to become a priority. What kind of nation watches the death of its children with indifference? And Canada has to be held accountable for what's happening here.
Ms. McLeod, the fact is most provinces and territories do have these advocates, but why do you think nothing has changed across the country, not just Ontario?
I think Charlie made some really good points. I know in British Columbia, the advocate has done tremendous work in terms of bringing it to the forefront, helping people know that we have some serious issues and these serious issues have to be dealt with. I can't imagine the place we would be in if we didn't actually have the advocate telling communities, telling government, telling the media what's happening out there. So for me, I absolutely understand a government wanting to balance its budget, but surely there can be ways you can balance a budget without, perhaps impacting the health and safety of youth in our country.
So as a Conservative, you believe a Conservative Premier is wrong in this case?
I think I can't speak for Ontario because I'm not familiar with the ins and outs like Charlie is. I know in British Columbia it is an important role, and it's an important role that, again, provincially flags issues that are critical.
Mr. Miller, do you support perhaps a child advocate not only for here in Ontario but across Canada that isn't subject to the whims of a provincial government?
Well, look, clearly what we've seen in Ontario is consistent with Mr. Ford's pattern of picking on minorities and those that are vulnerable. This may be his way of conquering. It certainly isn't a good way of governing. Consistent with what Charlie said, what we see, particularly in Indigenous communities, is horrifying. And as we shine a light on these things, we need to assume leadership in tackling very, very difficult issues and issues that don't have a one-stop shop solution. We invested $1.2 billion in childcare in 2018. This is a top priority for Minister Philpott. You can probably expect some announcements on this in the weeks to come. This is a horrifying situation, and child advocates do good work. You know the work that is done in Manitoba in rectifying a number of awful things that are going on in that province. We need to get a sense of what needs to be done. Talking to the NAN youth, which was actually quite a positive meeting, upbeat meeting with the Prime Minister. But they have challenges as well, and they highlighted their disappointment with the Ford government's decision.
Does that mean that the federal government has to step in and create a national office, though?
Well, look, when we start to see these inconsistencies with different levels of government that are completely contrary to what our policy is, clearly there's a role for federal leadership.
Ms. McLeod, I mean, what sort of steps did your government take to help child welfare, especially when you went after Cindy Blackstock so hard?
So I first of all want to go back to the point right here. The Minister Philpott has promised legislation around turning control over the child welfare system, the whole system to First Nations. We're waiting. It's like all the other legislation, whether it's Indigenous language rights, this is the government that we have now, and this is the government that's promised to make a difference. And clearly within whatever legislation she proposes, whether there's the will and the desire by First Nations to have an advocacy role, we need to see that within the legislation. But there seems to be no urgency on the federal government's part. I mean, 3 years now, and I think the only legislation of any significance we had was S3. So what's happened to all those other promises that they've made?
Well, we keep hearing about new child welfare legislation, Mr. Miller, that's supposed to actually come out of Indigenous Services. When do you expect to actually have something tabled?
Well, look, I think you can expect some announcements from Minister Philpott in the weeks to come. As you know, this is a top priority for this government. We've invested billions in Indigenous communities over the last couple budgets. Focusing on the gap that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous care is central to that. Everyone knows, or at least non-Indigenous Canadians should know, that there is a massive gap, and if we're going to represent ourselves as a country that supports Indigenous people, we need to step to the plate and assume the responsibility that we have in making things right.
Mr. Angus, I'll give you the last word on the topic. I guess you can comment on what you've heard so far.
Well, I think the problem with this government and previous governments is they always approach the issue of Indigenous children and say, well, this is what we have available. So, this is why we have underfunded schools. Well, the department doesn't have any more funds. We're not looking at it from a rights-based focus. The right to children to have safe water, the right of children to have proper education. The department's always nickel and diming, and this government's no different than any other government. They may have a few more nickels in the coffers, but children are still being denied. And what we need about an advocate is we need someone who can go to the bureaucracy, like what should have happened in the Wapakika deaths, and said, here's a plan sitting on your desk, and you're refusing to fund it, and children are going to die, and children did die, and the government was found culpable of refusing to help those children in the Wapakika deaths because it didn't meet the department's mandate. Until we have a way of breaking through that bureaucracy and saying the children come first, the children's rights come first, Indigenous children are going to continue to suffer in this country, under this government, under any government.
You mentioned nickels and dimes, but how do you turn the nickels into dimes when the government right now has got a huge deficit?
Well, it's actually interesting. So we have, the government has just come up with their stimulus package for business. Meanwhile, kids that I represent still don't have proper schools. They're still in mold-infested shacks. They're always told to wait. And then we keep hearing about record investments. Every government has said record investments. It's the oldest con in Confederation. They make these announcements. They promise it. They repromise it. They repromise it. How much of that money actually gets down into the communities? Very, very little. And you can see it on the ground in community after community. Until we start to actually dismantle the department, start to move the control and the development of out to regions like in my region, say Treaty 9, we're going to still see this shell game of promised money, money not spent, money returned to Treasury Board.
Okay, well, thank you for talking to me about this topic. After the break, the MPs are going to discuss the Indigenous Rights Framework Initiative. We'll be right back. Welcome back. From one crisis to another, and this one is about the so-called Indigenous Rights Framework. Ontario Chiefs are against it, BC Chiefs were supposed to be for it, and the Manitoba Métis wants it to happen as soon as possible. But now we hear it's not going to happen, at least not before the next year's federal election. It's supposed to give more power to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, but the details aren't clear. In fact, they've been murky at best. Mr. Miller, on the second round, I'll start with you. We've heard before that the government was going to table this legislation before Christmas. It doesn't look like that. What's the holdup?
Well, look, through our consultations and the various tables that are numbering in the 80s and the 100s with Indigenous communities, we've heard a number of things that should come as a surprise to no one, that people have different voices in different communities, and within those communities there are different voices. What we have heard as a theme, and it's been echoed most clearly by AFN, is that we need to take the time to do it right. And you know, this is a relationship that has gone on a number of centuries. It's broken, and we need to take the time to fix it. No one could imagine that 4 years of a Trudeau government would have fixed everything, but we did set the hope and expectation meter quite high. So people have told us take the time to do it right. Again, things that we've heard are, you know, what's the point of doing something like this when some of my treaty rights are not being recognized, when some of the inherent rights that are there are not recognized or enforced or executable. Clearly, when we say nation to nation, it means we have to listen to the nation that we're speaking to. And so when we hear those things, it's time to reflect, take the time to do it right, and take an approach that does make a particular nation's priorities the thing that we need to focus on. And a one-size-fits-all solution has been tried in the past and failed miserably. So we are going to take the time to do it right.
Mr. Angus, what is the framework supposed to be as far as you understand it?
Well, I think the one thing, you know, us white settlers never get is for Indigenous people it's always has been and always will be about the land, and the land rights are fundamental. And from many of the people that I've been speaking to about the rights framework, they felt that issue just was not being put on the table in a way that would guarantee the rights and sovereignty of the Indigenous people. The Prime Minister has made this promise of, you know, this new relationship his number one priority, but it seems like 3 years in, we're starting to get stuck in the mud. It started out with a lot of promises, but we're starting to see a lot of backtracking. My concern was the government went in and had a sense that they were going to be able to pull this off without listening. They did not listen, and now they're having to pull back. But I would urge the government to look at the framework put in place on the issue of UNDRIP, Romeo Saganash's bill on the rights of Indigenous people. We need to get that in legislation. That will, I think, bring a lot of certainty to the Indigenous communities to say, okay, now we have some good faith here, now we can start to move forward. But a long-term framework agreement is going to require government being willing to do what it hasn't been willing to do in the past, which is really say that the Indigenous communities have legal rights and title in areas of their lands and development, and have to be this equal partners. And we have to see if this government is willing to make that step.
Ms. McLeod, is that a solution to pass UNDRIP? I know you and your colleagues have some reservations about that piece of legislation.
So this rights and recognition, we all were in the House quite a long time ago now, where the Prime Minister stood up and promised. He made a promise to First Nations. So again, this is a case of, you know, overpromise and underdeliver. So, you know, I think First Nations rightfully need to be very concerned in terms of their hopes being raised by the Prime Minister, who did say this is the most important relationship, and time again, whether it's you know, consultation on the, you know, Kinder Morgan pipeline, they had the recipe in terms of what they needed to do from the previous court decision. So really, you know, they're really good at the talk, and they're really good at perhaps encouraging people, but when it comes to actual execution, I'd give them a D-.
Mr. Miller, there seems to be a lot of confusion out there surrounding this, even amongst some of us in the media. Is this a failure of your department to get the right message across? Or?
I would say it's actually a recognition that we need to do things a different way. We need to ensure the department is actually taking that nation-to-nation approach to heart. We hear consistently from First Nation communities that they're still talking to the same person who was denying them things 5-6 years ago. I don't put the responsibility on bureaucrats. I put it on government, and we need to make sure that we set the tone as part of our honor of the crown, which is a very lofty word, but where the rubber hits the road is making sure we listen to communities. We've had some great accomplishments, whether it's a number of settlements of treaty claims, recognition and entrenchment of a number of inherent rights, sectoral self-government agreements, which will lift people out of systemic undereducation. These are things we need to celebrate, along with the lifting of water advisories that have been around in some cases for decades. My colleagues would have attempted to, well, someone wouldn't have attempted to do this at all, but my other colleague would have tried to do this on a balanced budget, which would have meant massive cuts. So, you do hear a lot of indignation. We do need to recognize this, but we also have to recognize that this government has invested massive funds, historic funds, and they are historic, to right historic wrongs. Whether we will take the time to do this right, and we will listen to the people that we're talking to, and that is a radical shift from previous governments.
But then don't promise it before the next election. Don't stand up in the House of Commons as a Prime Minister and say, we're going to do this and we're going to introduce legislation and it's going to be done before the next election.
Yeah, well, I look forward to the members' support on this in that case.
Is they promised in this session, it's all coming after the next election. You have to re-elect the Liberals in order to get all that education money. You have to re-elect them to get all the child welfare money. That's where it's all coming. It's coming after the next election. So trust the Liberals, vote for them, and then you may get it. And that, again, is the story of Confederation going back 150 years.
To come back to the initiative, I know there are some groups out there, Mr. Angus, that do want it. The Manitoba Métis, for example, want it as soon as possible. Are we letting down some of those groups, though, if we take time to talk this out more?
I think that what's been let down is that the Prime Minister came in, said they were going to do it. I think because they just thought that people would, buy the pixie dust that the Liberals are throwing out here. And the communities, they are not going to go down that road. So the problem that we have is a minister who overpromised and has under-delivered on this file, who's gone around believing that just because by being nice you're going to get a framework agreement. You're not going to get a framework agreement just by saying nice things. You're actually going to have to do the work, and they haven't done the work yet. So this is why they're going back to the drawing board.
Ms. McLeod, I'm going to give you the last word on this. The initiative sounds like it can't be completed before the next election if the Conservatives form government next October. Is this something that your leader might put the brakes on completely?
So certainly we know that when we head into 2019, we're going to have a platform that includes environment, that includes Indigenous peoples, and certainly we'll be looking forward to presenting that at that time.
Okay, well, I want... did you have something to add?
I'm just, my jaw dropped, so I'm good.
Okay, on that note, I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Another break, but when we come back, a House committee continues to study whether Canadians need a holiday recognizing Indigenous people. Welcome back. The House of Commons Committee on Heritage is studying Bill C-369. It's a private member's bill introduced by MDP MP Georgina Jollybois, and it wants to create a new stat holiday called Indigenous Peoples Day. The federal government has promised to support the idea of this holiday. And earlier this week, former Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner Marie Wilson appeared before this committee. And in compelling testimony, she compared the proposed day to Remembrance Day, so that children who went to residential school and failed to return home could be honored.
We make great efforts to bring home with dignity and ceremony anyone lost and to honor the parent left behind. Each year, as we did recently, we honor a Silver Cross mother to represent all grieving parents. We mark Remembrance Day in national ceremony in all our schools and at monuments throughout the country in honor of all veterans, living or dead. And we acknowledge collectively those never found with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When have we ever demonstrated such reverence for residential school children, also lost in a state-sanctioned context of proven harms. We have failed to keep any track of them, much less bring them home in ceremony. We have shown unceremonious disregard for any parent left behind. How many days have we ever gathered together nationally to remember thousands of children who died on Canada's own soil? And as for the missing in circumstances still unknown, where is our national monument to the unknown child?
So for that reason, Wilson does not want the holiday to fall on June 21st, currently National Indigenous Peoples Day.
As we all know, the spirit, tone, and activities of Canada Day are very distinct from the spirit, tone, and activities of Remembrance Day. And so too would the spirit, tone, and activities of National Indigenous Day, as we already know it, be very distinct from those of a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, as we are calling for it.
A popular time discussed in committee for when the holiday should occur is in September, when children had to go back to school.
Not June 21st. Any other day in September would be a good one, because that's very symbolic. I didn't hear that before, but it makes absolute sense, because when September came around, we were ripped away from our families and shipped off.
Aaron Woodrick represented the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. He said another stat holiday would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Liberal MP Wayne Long grilled Woodrick about that point.
Has your group at all considered the cost of not doing it?
I don't know how you'd begin to quantify that. I mean, obviously, reconciliation is an important goal. I don't think there's anybody that disputes that. The question is, how would you quantify the value of not having a holiday on the impact of the ability for Canadians to experience reconciliation?
Do you think reconciliation should be free?
No, I think there's going to be costs involved.
In other news in the House, the NDP asked the government about a black mold crisis hitting Nunavut during question period.
This is a shameful and completely unacceptable situation for Canada's most vulnerable citizens. As a G7 nation, Liberals continually claim that we are leading the world in economic growth, yet we have Canadian children, babies, living in third world conditions. Why is this government delaying housing funding and prioritizing corporate tax cuts over Indigenous children suffering health problems? What is the Health Minister doing?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say, and we'll make this point very clear, the Minister in charge has asked CMHC to immediately get in touch with the Nunavut Housing Authority. Substantial dollars have been invested and bilateral accords have been signed with that government, and we want this problem addressed immediately. We have put the funds that we have put in place to support Indigenous housing and territorial housing, as we signed the bilateral with the Northwest Territories last week, are substantial. And by comparison, I would ask them to look at their campaign platform, which offered $25 million to the entire country, and that's it.
That's it.
Next week, Nation to Nation will come to you from Kamloops, British Columbia. It's ground zero for a class action lawsuit by students who went to day schools, but were not part of the residential school settlement. We'll talk to the main participants driving the lawsuit forward. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamarand. Thanks for watching.